Okay, so yesterday we started talking about how to upload images to storage. So I want to continue a little bit with that and talk a little bit more into that topic. So where we got yesterday is I had most of the code up and ready to go and upload it from users' gallery and say pictures that they've already taken. The one gotcha I ran into was that, oh, I need to be logged in to, it turns out, to upload anything. So I added a login screen. I pushed out a copy of that project, zipped up onto Discord, so you can get a copy of that with the login screen hooked up yesterday. So I want to pick up a little bit from where we left off there. Okay. So I'm here on, what page is this? This is page, let me get out of here. So I'm under the step 4. See a page number? Why is there no page number? But that's the page I'm on. So what I want to do is quickly go back to pull the project up and go ahead and get it running. So if you haven't pulled the project down that I uploaded to Discord, and you want to kind of follow along, then that would be when you pull up. Otherwise, follow along as you so choose. Okay. So where we've got it now is I can click on the gallery button here. I can pick one of the images that I've taken previously, and that will go ahead and upload, and you'll give me a download URL here. One of the things I probably want to do is give some sort of preview of that image. So we've used Picasso before. That'd be a good tool to use to show the image here. The good news is with Picasso, and I'm sure you've run into this already, Picasso can just straight up show a URI. If you provide it with URI, it will be able to show that. Previously, we've done that with maybe the avatars or other things that were HTTP URLs. It turns out it also works with content URLs as well. So we can go ahead and show that image here. So what I need to do in order to hook that up, I need to first go to my dependencies, and I need to make sure I add Picasso in. So I've already done that here. I've got Picasso added in. If you're grabbing the project from yesterday, you'll need to add that line in to add in Picasso. And then obviously sync the project. So going back to main activity now, which is kind of where that code is going to land. So once I've told it to upload an image, once I pick that image, at that point I have a URI for the image. I can just show that. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to change this a little bit. The log here real quick. I thought I changed that over here. I guess I didn't. So I'm going to grab in Picasso, kind of already written the code, so I'm going to grab it from there. I'll enter, bring that in. Here's my URI. So you get Picasso. I'm going to load that URI. I'm going to go ahead and resize it down to 400 by 400. Obviously, those numbers will depend on what project you're working with, what size it is in the layout. I'm basically pulling 400 by 400 because in the layout, I said it is 200 by 200. So it's double whatever I want in the layout. Cool. That gives the user a good preview. It is important to do a resize here because, remember, cameras are fairly high resolution. And so if you don't resize it, there's actually a potential that you could get out of memory errors. So we do want to make sure that we resize or scale the image down just in case they're having like a high resolution camera. Cool. That is that, adding that little piece in, will give us a little bit of preview, so user can immediately see, hey, there's the image we selected, right? It's going to appear there when I pick it, instead of just kind of staying blank. So that's kind of a common thing you want to do, is show it and then also kick off the upload process. The download link here, you might notice that it's not particularly friendly, right? This is really just a case of I'm using this for testing. This download URL would not be something that we'd actually put into, say, our project, because we don't want to show that typically. But in this case, as a demo, I do want to have that clickable and make it look more like a link. So I'm going to go back to layout and tweak a little bit before we go further. So if I go to the layout, here we are. One of the things you might notice in the preview, you might see that the text is going all the way to the edge of the screen. Does everybody see that? Okay. Now that's kind of interesting, because if you look at what I've got in the layout, in theory that layout has left and right margins, right? So it shouldn't be going to the edge of the screen. It should be stopped. Did everybody see that? Well, why is it? Why is it going to the edge of the screen? Well, first of all, URLs are very long, so it's having to wrap it in the middle of that word, quote unquote, because there's no spaces in the middle. The other thing is because I've set the width to wrap content, right? So this is one of those reasons where, especially when you have long text like this, it's always preferable to set the width to 0dp, because it's going to end up wrapping better or respecting your margins. So for this, I want to make sure I set it to 0dp or full width. Same with this one. I'm going to set the width of both the error and the download URL to full width. Now, if I want to keep those in the center, which sometimes is a desirable thing, because you'll notice as soon as I push those to 0dp, you notice how it shifted everything to be left aligned. Well, effectively already was left aligned, it's just where the element, its bounds was centered. So what I want to do is I want to shift this. I want to change the text alignment down here. So I'm going to center it here. I'm going to center it here. And that's going to push it back to the center. So typically speaking, if you have text views like this that you need to center, it's usually better to do a 0dp, stretch it to the full width of the container, and then center the text, and that will wrap better. So if I just look at that in the app now, there should be a little bit of margin instead of there being no margin on the edges. When it pops up, there you can see. So it's shifted in just a little bit. Cool. Other thing I might want to do is make this clickable. We did talk about this at some point. It's just been several weeks ago. I think it was in chapter 1.4, way back then. But what I want to do, or lesson 1.4, what I want to do is go to here, under common on that text view, the download URL. You should see that there is, well, it's not under common. Okay, so it's the auto link property is what I want to set. So I'm going to just go down to it, type in auto link, and tell it web. So if it finds any HTTP or HTTPS URLs, if it finds that in the text view, it's going to go ahead and turn them into links that are clickable, and will take the user over to the web browser of their choice. So that gives us a quick way to just test that link is actually functional. So I'm going to pick the image. It's going to come in here, and there I've got a nice blue link, which I should be able to copy over. And because I've not used Chrome on this device before, it's going to walk through the starter. But once I get into the browser, you can see that URL works, right? So now I actually have a URL that I can open in the browser. It's publicly usable. Cool. Questions on that? That's more just from the example side of things. Okay. So that kind of wraps up the first half of it, right? The first half of it is that I want to be able to pick something from the gallery, and I want that to be uploaded to the uploaded storage. Okay. The next half of it is how do I support the camera? Okay. I will forewarn you, I've still had some issues with the camera upload. I haven't fully worked it out yet, so I can walk you mostly to the end of what I know, but at the end I've not had good luck. I'm still getting some errors with trying to actually work. Okay, so I'll walk through you what I've found, what I know about, but I know that something that I'm doing is not right, and I've been trying to hunt it down on Stack Overflow and such and haven't had an answer as of yet. But all right, back to my notes. So let's talk about how we capture an image with the camera, right? We've done the file selector, or the file picker so far. We'll look at the camera. Okay, so most Android devices do have a camera built in that can capture images or video. In fact, a lot of devices have two cameras, you know, one on the front and one on the back. Or even further, we're looking at cameras that have even more to kind of get depth sense as well. It's still worth mentioning that there are a handful of Android devices that don't have cameras. It's kind of rare today, but it does still exist. Where might that occur? What are some devices that might not? Right, your smartwatches. So usually smartwatches don't have a camera. There's no saying that somebody couldn't come out with one, but most smartwatches don't, right? And if you're talking about a lower end tablet also might opt for not including a camera. It's not a required feature per se, okay? So one thing we do have to be aware of is that small slice of devices that don't have cameras is one thing to keep alert of. Also, most devices that do have a camera also are going to have a built-in camera app that you can use for taking pictures. So the emulators do, your physical Samsung devices do. In fact, sometimes the user may have more than one camera app installed that they use for different things, because some camera apps also include editing and other features like that. So typically, it is possible, it is possible to use the camera APIs directly and directly work with the image capture and do those things within your app. I generally would recommend against doing that because users generally have other apps already installed which are better, and in a lot of times they prefer them over whatever you're going to come up with. So usually it's a good idea to just go ahead and pawn that off to one of the camera apps that is already installed. Okay? There's a distant possibility that they don't have one, or they don't have an app installed for the camera, or they don't have a camera device, but typically they're going to have both of those things. So like we talked yesterday, implicit intents are a good way to kind of delegate work to those other apps. So we're going to again use an implicit intent to start the camera app. So rather than using that get content, we're going to use a different action to ask for the camera or initiate the camera. Okay. So the first thing we have to do in terms of working with the camera is we typically want to mark that our app requires or uses the camera. Okay. This is not strictly required. Your app will work if you don't specify this. You can get access to the camera. It is recommended though, because what it does is it does affect how your app is listed on the Play Store. Okay, so if I add here uses feature Android camera and say that it's required, well then when it goes on the Play Store, only devices that have a camera will be able to install it, right? So that way I'm filtering out any ones that might not be relevant, especially if a camera is a very important part of my application. Okay. On the flip side, oftentimes, and this is our case, the camera is helpful, but it's not strictly mandatory, right? I could have other ways of providing the image, such as, hey, I take the picture on this device, and then I actually upload it on another device. So it's not strictly required for us, but we should mention that it is a feature that we can use or might use. So that's where we would say in here, we would need to add use this feature, Android hardware camera, and we're going to say required false because it's not required. Okay? So that's just a good housekeeping thing. Again, it appears in the Play Store so that users know, hey, this might use your camera, or you might need a camera, so that they're aware of that. Okay? So I'm going to add that incorporate that into my manifest in this project. And you'll definitely want to make sure you incorporate that into your game library project. But we want to set this to false to say, hey, it's not required. We are okay with you using our app if you don't have a camera, because it's not the primary function of this app, but it is something we use. Okay? So that's one step in there, is we're going to add that to the top of the manifest. And notice where I'm putting that. I'm putting that up above the application tag, but underneath the manifest. It's in the same place where we ask for permissions. So for instance, if you ask for internet permissions, it's the same place as this. Okay, back to here. It's also possible once we get into the app itself, there is an API to check if the device actually has a camera or not. And so we can use that programmatically to determine, okay, we're going to turn these buttons on or off based on whether or not the user has a camera device installed on their phone. Okay? So let's look at what that might look like. Let's say I'm going to bring this in, has camera. So I'm going to bring that into main activity. Okay? So what I might want to do, I might want to say, hey, if they don't have a camera, then let's disable the camera button. Okay, well, the camera, if not available. So I'm going to bring that in. I am actually in a context, so that's just this. And I need to refer to this package manager. Quick aside, the package manager, what that is that's the actual what installs or manages the apps that you have installed in your phone. So that's what we're talking about, is this is managing the installed apps. Okay, it is worth mentioning too, the features on the package manager are, a lot of those you can't get to anymore because they've been locked down, as you need to be a rooted device or a super user kind of thing to get to some of those features. But this one particularly we can get to. So this will tell us whether or not we have a camera. And so what I can then do is I might say, hey, let's take the camera button and set its visibility based on whether or not there is a camera, whether or not the device has a camera. So I might say has camera, question mark, and I would say u not visible, otherwise view dot gone. So if this device doesn't have a camera, then they won't be able to click the camera button. It will just work for them in all other ways, but they won't be able to access that one feature. And by the virtue of it being gone, it won't also take up any screen real estate.
Well, how will that affect the chain?
That's a good question, right? So in the layout, right, it's going to be gone. What should happen is that the gallery button should be centered underneath the image. So we want to check that that's occurring, but that should be what happens. Okay. Now on this device, obviously the camera button is still visible because this device has a camera. Okay. So what I need to do is specifically, if I want to test that, I need to create a different device that doesn't have a camera. Okay, so I'm going to create a new virtual device in here. I'm going to keep this as a think of pixel, Android R, and when we go to set it up here, okay, did I pick the right one? Yeah, Android R. I'm going to go under advanced options. And there's more options down here about what specific hardware it has. So for instance here you can see that there is, under camera, there is a front and back camera, and the default is that the front is emulated as it says, and the back is a virtual scene. So what I can do is I can turn both of these to none, right? So now there is no camera, neither a front or a back camera, and when I create this device, and I need to say, maybe name that one, so I'm going to go to edit and say without camera. So when that fires up, I can try to run the app on there, and we'll see that works. So that's how you get to that. If you need to turn on and off different hardware, change the hardware configuration, you can do that when you're setting up the emulators. That's one of those benefits of the emulators. You don't really get that with a physical device. I can't just remove or disable a component easily, but I can do that much easier to come up with various configurations on the emulator. So I'm going to give that a minute to boot up. Alright, so we have that up and running. I can hit run to get it onto this device. And there is, I'm going to log in. Now that's interesting, because the camera button is still there. Why did that not function? That's feature A. So is it signaling as that is still true?
Checking to see if you actually have a camera app on there.
And it's still going to have a camera app, likely. But I don't see. Maybe I'm mistaken. Let's check the other device. So over here. I don't think there's actually
Camera app in the top left one.
Oh yeah, there it is. So this one does have the camera app, but the other one does not. It's interesting that it still thinks that it's there. So that might require some more investigation, because obviously that check is not working the way it should. So I may have to look into that further and figure out what's going on there. That was something I probably should have tested ahead of time, but didn't come around to. So. So in theory, that would be how you would check that and check for whether or not that was visible. Okay, so I'll have to look into that. Talk about the next thing. I'm running into a lot of things in this where the documentation that Android's put out is kind of out of date. In a lot of ways, this kind of feels to me, uploading images should be something that's fairly simple, fairly standard, but I found a lot of places where the documentation is really lacking. So that's been part of my conundrum at the moment. So let's talk about the next thing, though. So how do we start the camera app itself? Okay. So kind of like I mentioned yesterday, the easiest way to start that up is to just say, hey, we're going to create an implicit intent, and we're going to call start activity with that intent. So if I just take this one line of code, start activity, new intent, media store, action image capture. So I take that and I stuff it into my on-click listener. So where is my on-click listener? Should be, here it is. So it's kind of like what we did first yesterday that I showed you. Hey, we could go start it simply this way. Run it. Go here. And just by starting that intent, right? Okay, now we're in the other app, right? So that's the bare minimum, right? If we say start intent, that will take us over to the camera app, whatever camera app the user has installed. We can potentially take a picture. So you click on the picture icon, and then you click on check, and it takes you back here. Okay. Now, one thing I remember, one of the things I had to do is out of the box, this is not going to give us back the result, right? This is not going to give us the answer of what did the user actually pick. It's going to take them over to the other app and let them take that picture, but we won't actually have access to the picture. Another gotcha is that if I do it this way, if I just call start activity, no extras or anything like that, then what it gives you back, the only thing it gives you back potentially is the thumbnail. It just gives you a small version as a bitmap of what they do. Another gotcha is that with the new system, the new way of getting that results API that we saw yesterday for how we get the image back from the file selector, the file picker, that doesn't actually give you the bitmap. So the only way to get the image back, or to get the full-size image back specifically, is we have to provide a URI that tells it where to save that image. Okay. So we actually have to tell the camera app what file you want to save it to. Okay. So the way we do that is we need to construct a URI, and then we pass that in as an extra, call it media store.extra output. We put that URI in, and then it will try to save it to that file, and when it comes back, it'll be there. Okay? Everybody hear that? The gotcha is building out that output URI, that URI where you save it, is actually a rather difficult thing, right? So I don't want to necessarily get into all the details of that yet, but recognize this is something that we're going to have to tackle here. As far as how do we tell it where to save it, okay? So that's a problem in and of itself. To get the captured image, what we want to use is the new results API. Okay, with the new results API, just like we did yesterday, the first step is to create a launcher. So we're going to create a new launcher using the take picture contract. That's one of the standard contracts. When we provide a callback, this callback, unfortunately, what it gives us is a Boolean. Okay, it gives us a Boolean. It doesn't give us a URI to the file, unlike the other one did, which means that there's a little bit more stipulation there. So far, I haven't been able to find a definitive answer of what that Boolean represents. My understanding has been that if it's true, then yes, a picture was saved successfully and you can read it, and if it's false, that you can't. But I haven't been able to find that in the documentation anywhere. But that's been my kind of understanding of how it's supposed to behave. So far, I haven't had it successfully come back as true, though. So I think I'm still missing something. Okay. So that's what we need to define. We need to define this launcher. Just like I had done yesterday, the place I want to define that launcher is up towards the top. I'm going to define that as an instance variable. So we now have two launchers. One for get content and another one for taking a picture. Okay. Because both of these are launching another activity and getting a result back from that activity. Yes?
When you said you didn't want to put a whole bunch of code inside of these launchers, was that just the line 39's method call there?
Right, that's what I'm talking about, is what's happening with line 39 could get pretty expansive, so I want to push that over to somewhere else. Okay. I'm not too worried about the if statement. In fact, putting the if statement here just makes that other code simpler, right? Because then I don't care about running it if it's not there. Similarly, here I might check that this is true and not call the other function if it's false, right? So that does sort of simplify things. Okay, so I want to put that launcher in, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to where we were starting that intent. So when you click on the button, what I want to do is use that launcher, take picture launcher. We're going to call launch. Okay, and you remember from yesterday that this takes an argument. So in this case, it took an image. In this case, it takes a URI. So that URI is specifically the URI where we're going to have the output or the file being written. Okay. So temporarily speaking, I'm going to just pass in null for that. I'm going to say let's launch it with null and see what we get. So I go back to the I go to the camera again, take picture, hit check mark. We do come back here, and what I notice immediately is I've forgotten to do something important. I forgot to tell it to do anything in response to when it came back, so I don't actually know if it worked. So maybe I need to go back into here and just do a quick log. So log.i log tag, and I'll say take picture result, and let's log that as results. There. So at least I can see something. Pull Logcat up, and I'm going to try and hit that button. And camera stopped. So you can see there, take picture result false. Okay. What I was able to find out from a little bit of history is that, again, this contract thing, the system is relatively new, and so in the development of it, it had a bit of a different API where they did pass back potentially, if you pass null in there, you could potentially get back the bitmap, but now it just basically fails because it presumes that you provided an output URI. So we do have to somehow give it instructions for where to save the file. So everybody with me? Okay. So that's the next part that we have to tackle. In order for it to actually give us something back, we have to successfully get it tell it where to save it, and have to get it saved to the disk. Okay. So let's look at what we've got. What can we work with? So we need to build up that output URI. Okay, we need to build that up so we can pass it in and when we launch the activity. Okay, because wherever we pass that URI to, that's where we're going to save the full size image, wherever it captures in, whatever its negative resolution is. Generally speaking, those photos that we capture, we're going to put them into a public external storage folder. Now, those words are kind of important. In the world of Android, there's a lot of little nuances with the file system, and that's is a little bit of a gotcha because it's changed over time. I've also had the history that Samsung and Google devices and Pixels have had different behavior to how they deal with the file system. So the file system is supposed to be standard from manufacturer to manufacturer, but isn't always that. Okay. So in the world of Android, there's this idea of public files and private files. Public typically means that any app on the device can access those files. Is everybody with me? So public means that any file, any app on your device can access those files. Means that they're not stored under the directories that your application owns. When you install an app on your phone, it gets its own directory to store data. In fact, that private directory is where we're storing the data for Firestore, or who's logged in. All the authentication and Firestore data. That cache, same with Picasso, is stored in our local folder. So those, that public is anywhere. Private would be only for your application in particular. You can save files to either of those. We also talk about the difference between internal storage and external storage, and that difference is a little bit more murky. So internal historically has meant for sure that the device, it's part of the device. Like its internal memory is part of the device and typically can't be upgraded. You get a certain amount of internal storage when you buy the device, and that's all the internal storage you will ever get. External storage, on the other hand, would be things like an SD card, right? If you have an SD card, then that classically is your external storage. Or if you have a USB flash drive that you're connecting with a on-the-go cable to the device, that would also be external storage, okay? One thing to be wary of as well is that Android is based on Linux and not Windows. And Linux and Windows have a different way that they see the file system. So C, on Windows, you're used to the C drive and the D drive and the E drive, etc. They're usually lettered drives. You start with C drive being the main operating system, and you just go on as you add more drives. Linux doesn't normally function that way. Okay, so Linux, actually the way it functions is it tries to make your system look like there aren't separate hard drives. That's kind of core to how Linux works, is you can't tell what hard drive your data is actually on. Okay, you can't tell what drives the data is actually on. So different folders that you have on your device may be on different drives. Okay, the way that happens internally is a system called mounting, and basically what we do is we say, hey, this portion or this partition of this drive is mounted to this folder, right? So if you're looking at this folder, then that's some partition on whatever device, okay? So that means as we're traversing, you can find, okay, well, this may be on external or internal depending on what the path to it is. Cool? Yes?
How does like cloud storage factor into that, like iCloud or Google?
Yeah. So good question. When we're talking about that, largely that is kind of neither. Okay, so when we're talking about it, neither and both. So when we're talking about, you got your files that are uploaded, right? Your device never has a full picture of all of the files that are in Google Cloud or Drive or whatever. It's never going to have a full picture of that. So there will always be files that are on Drive that aren't on your device, okay? So what it will do is, as you're operating on those files, it will temporarily grab a copy and save it down. Okay, so at any given time you only have a small subset of your files, depending on what you've used recently or what you've told it to download, etc. Okay, and it will try to keep those up to date if you said, hey, I want an offline version of those. But that's one side of things. If we're talking about Google Drive or Google Docs, those are going to be private files. Those are going to be private storage, so if you're opening up a Google Sheet, that would be in the private storage of the Google Sheet app. Or Google Docs would have its private Google Docs. You're using the version of Word that runs on mobile. More than likely it's going to be in the private data for Word, but also Word is able to open external files that you've downloaded from other sources, so it might be an external file, it might be an internal file, it might be private or public, with Word. Okay. And some of that depends on, like, say, hey, if you're pulling it down from Office 365 or SharePoint, it's going to function one way, or if you're pulling it down from Google Drive or wherever, it's going to function differently, email attachment, etc. Another gotcha that gets confusing is external storage is not as obvious as it used to be. So the original definition of external was just, hey, this is something that's not part of the Android hardware, right? It's like a flash card or a USB drive that you're plugging in. That's not the case and hasn't been the case for a while, okay? So in a lot of ways, your external storage is just like your D drive. You can think of your internal storage kind of like your C drive, where Windows is hosted, and your D drive is encompassing external storage. Most devices out of the box today ship with already a predefined division in the actual hardware storage. So if you buy, like, say you have your Samsung tablets, even without an SD card, they have external storage. Okay, it's just subdivided. You say, hey, this partition. If you've ever worked with partitions in Windows, it's kind of the same idea. This partition, this much of the storage space, is internal, and this part of it is external. So there is a little bit of a gotcha, which gets confusing, unfortunately, when working with the APIs. Because sometimes when you're talking about external storage, it doesn't mean what it used to mean. Okay. So external storage more often than not today is more similar to public. If it's external, then it's more likely it's public in some shape or form. It doesn't really mean much about the actual hardware that's there. Okay, makes sense? There is one thing that does happen sometimes. Typically, the internal storage is guaranteed to always be there and loaded first when the operating system starts. As the operating system is booted up, though, the external storage might not be there initially. It may be loaded a little bit later, depending on the device and the manufacturer you're working with. Okay? That only matters if you're looking at doing things early in the boot process. Okay, which we're late in the boot process, so it's not as big a deal. Okay? So, that's a few things to understand in terms of what those terminology means. You're going to see public, you're going to see private, you're going to see the terms internal and external. Okay? So what that means is we really have two options. We can have our files or images that we capture with the camera. We could either store them privately within a particular folder in our app, or we could store them publicly in a shared folder that every app on the device can get to. Okay, and so typically with something like this, we would share them publicly. Has been historically the way we've done that. The problem with that is, again, you're talking about public storage. Well, every app on your device can potentially read and write those files. That could be pretty dangerous, right? One malicious app gets installed on your device, and now all your public photos and all your public music is out there. They've yoinked it, downloaded it, put it on their servers, right? So there's been some efforts in recent years to try and lock down public storage so it is less public. Okay, so that's part of what's happening there and moving things more towards private and internal storage kind of things. Okay. What we would like to do, at least following the instructions that they talk about, is we're going to take this picture, we're going to put it in public. One of the, at least the theoretical benefits, which I'm not sure that this is manifested, in reality, because we've got two apps working with each other, right? We've got the camera app and we've got our app. Effectively, that means that two apps have to be able to read and write the file that we're going to create. So that makes things a little bit tricky with the security rules, because it does have to be accessible to two separate files. So in theory, the easiest way to that answer to that would be, oh, let's just put it on public external storage, and then everybody can get to it. Okay, but that's changed with some of the recent versions. Okay, so what I saw from what the docs say, looking through this guide, say the best way to get this public external storage, they say go to the environment class. Okay, environment references a bunch of different folders, standard folders that are on Android. They say get external storage public directory. We tell it which directory, so we're going to tell it to get pictures. Okay. This is going to give us back a file, a path, basically, to that particular directory on the device. Okay, so you can look at that, and in fact, if we look at that, we'll see some of the paths and some of the folders and some of the way that Android is structured, because there's quite a few folders down there, right? So that will give us a directory, and from there we can start to build up our URI. Right, we can start to build up the file, the path to that file that we want to create and what we want to refer to. Okay. So that's one part of it. This is the part that I'm honestly least sure about. This is the part that was in the particular tutorial. I looked over Stack Overflow. There's some different answers to this. This is probably the one I have wrong. I'm not sure about that for sure, but I think this is probably the one I have wrong. And we use more research. One other thing, we kind of also need to add some permissions to our app, namely to be able to read and write external storage. There is a little bit of shifting to how these permissions work. So historically in the past, if you have those permissions, you could read and write any file that was in public storage that was shared between apps. If you had those two permissions, you read and write any file, period. What's happening is they're changing a little bit of how that works. So you don't necessarily need those permissions depending on what you're doing. There's a little bit of nuance there that I'm not fully understanding yet, but there are some cases where you don't need that. Part of the reason we're doing that is historically, these have been such important apps that important permissions and such an important thing that virtually every app on your device has these two permissions. So they basically became meaningless because every app needs it. So if any app that includes a camera needs it, so every app in the phone has it, and it does very little in terms of securing data. Because really, when we're talking about permissions, in order for users to see that and be alerted to, okay, that might be a permission that's concerning, it needs to be something that most apps don't ask you for. Does that make sense? If users are used to seeing that on every app, well, yeah. But we're going to go ahead and add those permissions, because it can only serve to help us. But there's a little, just to be aware, there's a little push towards not having that in every app. Which is where there's a little warning here. You know, hey, write external devices. External storage no longer provides write access when targeting Android 10 Plus. Everybody see that kind of warning? So because I'm working with an API 30 image, that's maybe part of why I'm seeing some different behavior than I did last year or recent years. Okay?
Oh, so it's taking a photo and then it just won't allow us to save it. And that's why it's
kind of. It's I've been getting permission issues with trying to save the file, trying to save the image, and I think it's partially rated to the changes in Android 10, but I haven't had a chance to fully read up on all of those things yet. So it may be related to some of this. Okay, but I'm going to add those two permissions just in case it helps. The next thing I need to do is, once I kind of know what directory I'm going to, I also need to figure out a name for that file. Okay, it's important that that name typically has to be collision resistant, where I don't want to typically use the same name multiple times because I don't want to accidentally overwrite the file that's there. In this case, it maybe isn't as necessary because I'm just taking a profile picture, and so maybe it's okay if I keep writing over that. But oftentimes we want to generate one that's semi-random. Okay, so there's two main ways to do that. One way is to use the timestamp, the current date and time, as part of the file name. The other way to do that is to use a GUID or a UUI, a random identifier. Oftentimes those in fact are used together. It's not unusual to see even both of those combined into the file name. Okay, so if we're looking at this function that I have here, let's look at kind of the pieces that are fitting in. Okay, so I called this file, this function create image file. You'll notice immediately that it throws IO exception. Okay. There's a lot of things in here. Basically everything you do with file IO can throw an IO exception. So there's several places in this where this can fail. Usually it fails for permissions reasons. And so rather than trying to deal with every one of those, we're just kind of going to bubble them up and we'll handle them. We'll catch those exceptions further up where we call this function. It's typically the way this is handled. Okay? So and I'm also saying at the end of the day, it's going to return a file object. A file object in Java is basically, it's a path to either a directory or a file. That's one gotcha. It doesn't necessarily have to be a path to a file. It could be a path to a directory because they're kind of the same thing as far as Java is concerned. Okay. So I'm going to say calendar.getInstance. Okay, calendar.instance getInstance will give me basically the current date and time. There's actually 3 date time APIs in Java right now. So I want to mention that real quick. The original one that was introduced into Java is the date class. Date class has been around since Java 1.0. It's also the most buggy of all the options. There's some choices that they made, which a lot of people don't agree with, and a lot of people at this point are really were bugs. So for instance, with the date class, one of the weirdnesses is that month starts at 0. So if I've got January, that's month 0 in the Java world. Okay, most other frameworks don't do that. Okay, the one exception to that where this also exists is in JavaScript, because quite literally the writers of JavaScript copied all the bugs from the date class. They copied the same exact API. So the same bugs that exist here in the Java world also exist in the JavaScript world with the date class. So we don't usually, I usually try to avoid working with the date object itself directly for one of those reasons. The other thing commonly is that year year 1900 is 0. So if I get year 22, or actually we would be 19, I think it's 1900. So we would be year 122 by Java's reckoning, rather than year 2022. That throws a lot of problems with the date math. There are also some cases where, again, this is old code. It's been around since the early 90s. It's not really resilient to things like doing two things at once, parallel processing, and those kind of things. Internally, the date object itself is just a really thin wrapper around something called the Unix timestamp. It's really just a thin wrapper around that, which kind of gets its origins in the world of Unix and Linux. Okay. Unix timestamp is the number of milliseconds that have passed since, does anybody know the date? What's the Unix epoch? It's an important date to remember. January 1st, but not 1970.
I was going to guess 72.
Yeah. So January 1st, 1970, midnight. That date is referred to as the beginning of the Unix epoch. And this is something that comes from Unix and Linux. And it's actually permeated almost every operating system that's out there. Okay? Even on Mac, you'll find the same idea. So why January 1st, 1970 midnight? Well, that's when the first Unix computer was turned on. Short answer there. Short answer is that the first time the Unix computer, the very first Unix computer was turned on was January 1st, 1970. And so now all our timekeeping is based on that. Okay. So this exists, you know, it's really just a wrapper around this timestamp. It's stored as a long, and so that's inherently how the math is done, right? All the math is based on how many milliseconds has it been since then. Okay. It does make things hard in a lot of scenarios because you have a lot of weirdness that you have to deal with. This exists even in C#. You can find this where there's a class that wraps this Unix timestamp. In JavaScript, it's the same idea where the date class wraps this Unix timestamp. So if I remember right, you can literally just call, if I've got a date, I can call getTime. That will return this long. And so historically, we've done kind of math with that long. Okay? What are some gotchas with that underlying it? Just using that as a basis. Well, it means you're already starting, whatever math you do, you're already starting with relatively large numbers, right? We're talking about, that's 52 years ago now, right? So we're already talking about, we're already relatively large numbers, so that's part of why we have to store it in a 64-bit number, because, so I say we're coming up on the advent of it not fitting into a 32-bit number. So, other things that this throws a wrench into is, well, what if I want to refer to time before 1970, like somebody's birth date? Well, then that becomes a negative number. So we have negative time before 1970, which you have to deal with. The other thing that happens is what about all the countries and the states that have changed their time zones? between 1970 and today. Well, in order for me to know what time it is right now, I have to know, first of all, where you are on the globe, and then all of the changes that have happened to the time zone rules between 1970 and today. If I get any of those things wrong, your location or the changes to the time zone, well, then I'm showing you the wrong time. Why might that be relevant to us?
We're building mobile apps, and so we can expect our users to be all over the place.
Okay, so that's one part, right? So like the GPS coordinates, right? Now typically your Android device will automatically kind of pay attention to the GPS and try to switch the time zone for you, right? What happens when your government decides to change the rules? Well, your device can't know that ahead of time, okay? In fact, the rules to change, the rules of all the time zones are baked into an open source project, if I remember right, it's called TZ Data. And they maintain a giant database of all the time zone stuff that's happened since 1970, in fact, even further back in history. But they're maintaining a giant database. If that database is wrong, well, then you have the wrong time zone. Okay? That database on Android devices is shipped with the base operating system. In fact, the only way to get into there is you have to get into the firmware and kind of change it. It's in the part that's reserved for, hey, you want to change the time zones on a Samsung device? Samsung's got to do that. They've got to push out an update to all their phones or their tablets to be able to have the correct time zone information.
Could be wrong, but didn't they just recently pass something where they're going to get rid of daylight savings or something like that?
Right, because daylight savings time figures in here, right? If I'm measuring milliseconds since 1970, I have to know where you sit in terms of daylight savings time. So yeah, that entry, if the thing passes that they recently filed, I think it passed the
Passed in the Senate.
House, or passed in the Senate, but hasn't passed in the House yet.
Yeah.
So if that does pass and that does go into effect, that builds a new record into this database, which means that every Android device in the US now has to get updated, because we're basing the time on 1970, right? So that's one kind of understanding there. It's also going to mean that every Windows device is going to have to update, so it has the right time zone information, etc. So you're kind of seeing some of the conundrums, right?
Now's a great time to hack every device in the entire world.
So there's going to be some work out there that a few companies, namely Google and Microsoft, are going to have to tackle if some of those things happen. Not that it's the first time that this happened, because this has happened surprisingly a lot throughout the globe. So those are some of the gotchas with this. Okay, so that's how the date class works internally. It's really just a wrapper around this. There's one field. It contains that long, and that's basically the entire class. The entire class is just functions that take this timestamp and return you things like the month of January being null and 1900 being 0. This class has been around for so long. As I said, it's been around since 1.0. It basically works with everything. It is supported everywhere. But as I said, it's usually the most buggy. So what are our alternatives? So actually the people at Sun writing Java quickly found out that this was a bad idea. All of those things were maybe a problem. You know, hey, the month should start at 1. The year should actually be just the year, right? 2022 should be 2022, not some weird offset. And we shouldn't base our time off of the time since 1970, right? And especially because you have to deal with other things like, what about the Hebrew calendar or Hindu calendar, other kind of calendars? What about lunar calendars that aren't based on 12 months, right? So that's part of where the calendar class came into, is also to understand those other kinds of calendars, okay? So typically on our devices, if I say calendar.getInstance, you're going to get what we call a Gregorian calendar. That's actually how we measure things in the US. So you're getting an instance of that. If you were to use this on, say, an Israeli device, then you would be getting potentially the Hebrew calendar instead. Okay, so that's one thing to understand. Internally to that calendar, it actually stores the different pieces of the date as separate parts. So rather than storing things as here's one single number, effectively internally a calendar looks more like this. If you were to look at the stores, you would find something much closer to that. There's a bunch of different values that all have keys, integer keys, and they can have a number, or actually they can also be null. It is possible for some of the values within a calendar to be null. Okay? So that means you've got things like the year, the month, the day, the hour, the minutes, the seconds, AM, PM. All those things are stored at separate keys within the calendar object. Okay? So that's version 2. That's version 2. And again, that one came in so quick. It was either like Java 1.1 or Java 1.2, I forget. But it was early enough to kind of like, oh yeah, we goofed this up. Here you go, right? There's still a lot of code out there, even in Android examples, that use the date class over the calendar class, because there's been kind of mixed support, right? So they introduced this early, but a lot of the APIs didn't get adapted until later to work with this. Okay, so around Java 5, we got the string format function, which is what I'm using here, is string format. Okay, string format understands how to format time, dates, and times using this calendar object. Okay, but it relies on a weird syntax. Okay. So everybody see my format string? Okay. The string format, I'm passing 3 arguments. First I'm saying locale US. Second is the format string. And the third thing is the calendar, is the actual calendar object. Okay. So the first thing I'm passing in there, locale US. Okay. That's the US locale. I'm forcing it to that to say, because I'm working with a file, I don't actually want the name of that file to be based on the user's locale. I actually want that always to be in the US locale. Because otherwise I might get into weird cases where, hey, they switched locales and now they can't find their file because it's a different file name. So I want to make sure that this is always writing with the same locale. Okay. With the format string, this is where I say, hey, here's some special things that I want to put in there. Okay. One thing to kind of understand in terms of context, the thing that comes after the format string are the parameters, the replacement things that go into the format string, and they start at index 1. So now is actually the first parameter to the format string. Okay? Everybody good with that? So the third parameter in the function call, but conceptually in the format string, it's the first parameter. Okay? All right. So from the start, image underscore, that's just fixed. That's just fixed. That's just hard-coded. It's going to start with image underscore. Okay? Where it changes and it's special is anytime you see this dollar sign, or sorry, the percentage sign. So percentage sign determines how you're doing the formatting. So let's talk about that a little bit. So I've mentioned this before, because I did this one time when I extracted some strings. But we've already talked about %d and %f. So remember what %d represents. I'm up on the whiteboard, by the way.
Integer, right?
Integer.
Yeah.
So this represents a placeholder for an integer. %f is a placeholder for
Float.
a float. Percent s.
Space.
What data type start with? String.
String.
So this is a string. Okay, so those are our base, right? If I need to create a format string and put things in, integer, float, string. If the types mismatch between the parameters and the type you have in here, you just get an exception and it doesn't give you back your formatted text. Okay, so we do have to make sure those things work. Okay? Another piece. So if I have, sometimes I want to refer to a parameter multiple times. So in this way, if I just use these, it will just take them in the order that they're specified, right? So if I say %d, 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 that's going to be first argument, second argument, third argument. Make sense? Sometimes I need to refer to the same argument multiple times. Okay? So that's the case here. So I need to refer to not first, second, third. I need to refer to the same argument again. We do that by adding in a prefix or a kind of a modifier in here. So %1 $ says just use the first one. So then if I do something like this, I'm referring not to the three parameters, parameters 1, 2, 3. I'm referring to parameter 1, parameter 1, parameter 1. Make sense? You tracking with me? So we put that in. If I want to refer to parameter 2, it'd be $2, $3, etc.
So that accepts 3 different parameters then?
I can accept an arbitrary number of parameters.
Okay.
I can take an arbitrary number of parameters after my format string.
What I meant was that accepts any of those 3 different formats for that first parameter.
No, they're all the same.
Oh, they're all the same. Oh, sorry. They're %d, I see.
3 copies. I just got 3 copies of the same integer.
Oh, okay.
Right? Okay. The reason that's relevant is because notice how many parameters I'm passing in. 1. I'm passing in the 1 calendar object, but I need to use it 5 times. I need to use it for the year, the month, the day, the hour, and the minute. Cool? Okay. So how does that work? Well, there's another starting point here. %t refers to time. That's a placeholder for a time. Okay? Now that time can be any of 3 things. It could be a date, it could be a calendar, or it could be the latest rendition of the date and time APIs, the local date time. Because back around Java 8-ish, they finally fixed a lot of the problems, and so there's a brand new java.time package, which has a lot better classes that work so much better. Unfortunately, not every device on the market is up to that point where you can use the Java 8 APIs yet in Android. Okay, so that's why we're not doing that yet. We're still stuck with calendar. Cool. Okay, so %t is a time, means it can be any one of those things: date, calendar, or local date time. Okay. Now, %t isn't really enough to tell you how do I want to output it, right? If I say %t, do I want what part of the time? Does that make sense? So if I say, what I can do is I can say %t, look at that, yep, ty with uppercase y. Things to be very careful about is lowercase and uppercase don't work the same. So this is the four-digit year. If you change the casing on that second letter, it will behave differently. Okay? So that's the four-digit year. %tm. I think that's what I have in here. Yes. %tm is the two-digit month, fortunately based on 1. And %td is the two-digit day of the month. So day of the month. So that goes from 1 to 31. Okay. On the time side of things, %th is Army time. It's two-digit hour, and so that runs 0 to 23. Okay. That's going to run 0 to 23. Uppercase M is the two-digit minute, which would be 0 to 59. One thing to watch here, remember I said the casing is very important. Notice lowercase m is a month, uppercase m is a minute. Way different. That is one thing that's very easy to fat finger, unfortunately. and I've done that. I've also found that these two m's are swapped between what they are in C#. C# actually does the reverse, where uppercase m is the month and lowercase m is the minute.
Is there a lowercase y?
There is a lowercase y. I don't have it offhand to know what it is. I think that might be the two-digit year.
Oh, okay.
But I don't remember for sure. Okay. So we've got those, right? Those are the parts that we're going to put in. If I needed seconds, I think seconds is either uppercase s or lowercase s, right? So that's what we're doing here. Is everybody tracking with me? Okay. Back to the code. Now you understand what craziness I'm doing here. Zoom it in as much as I can. So let's see if we can read this. So the first thing, that 5-character string represents the 4-digit year. Okay, so I'm saying %1 $, so it says refer to the first argument and give out its year. It's a time, give out its year. Okay. Next part, you can see again the $1 It's the month. It's the day. It's the hour. It's the minute. Does everybody see that? Mm-hmm. One of the weird things about these type of format strings is it's hard to know where the placeholders end. The placeholders always start with a percent, but they don't have a like semicolon or anything at the end. So you do have to watch a little bit to figure out what's a literal M or part of the template string, etc. So then we're saying it ends with .jpg. I might need to change that if I wanted a different file extension, but here I'm just saying, hey, these are JPEGs. Okay? Does that format string kind of make sense now in what we're doing? It's year, month, day, and then hour, and minute. That's what I'm filling in. It's a little bit cryptic. I hope you can see. Yeah. I much prefer the way that C# does these template strings, hands down. I much prefer how they do that over how Java has chosen to do it. But as I said, they inherited this system from C. So this sort of language is inherited from C. Specifically in the world of C, if you ever want to find the documentation, there's a function called printf. And in the specification of this syntax, you'll find where this originated. It's not necessarily exactly the same as printf in C, but that's where it gets its base syntax. Okay?
Just so
yes.
Perfectly clear, the now is
yes.
the instance that you're getting, that's the parameter that you're talking about.
That is the parameter. That is the first parameter to this template string.
Cool.
So that's the date stamp that I'm using in all those places. Cool? Okay. So that's all I'm trying to do with those 2 lines of code is just generate a file with the date and time in it. That's it. You'll notice it's only down to the minute. So if you try to do this twice in the same minute, then you're going to get not different file names. You might get the same file name. So you might need to go further and add the second. Cool?
Will it overwrite it, or because we're using this to output the...
Oh, potentially override it.
Okay.
Yeah, potentially you would get an overwrite. Really depends on what you do later in the code, right? So, all right, so that's my file name. Again, the other ways you could construct that, another common way to construct this is to take, there's a UUID class in Java, which gives you a random number, and I believe the function is random UUID, I think is the function that you call on that. So that's another way that this commonly gets done, is we might stick a random UUID to the end of the name instead of trying to deal with date and timestamps, just partly because they're this messy, and because of worrying about collisions about things being at the same time. Okay, next thing up is we need to figure out what directory we're going to push it to. So here I'm going to say I want to go to get external storage public directory. So I'm going to call that. That should in theory give me a public directory that every app can write to. I've already asked for permissions for that. And then within there I have to provide a string, and that tells it kind of what subfolder within the public that you want, or what kind of files you want. So we're asking for the pictures directory, okay? Because I want photos, I want images. All right, and then from there, I'm creating another file object, so that gives me one file object. I'm going to say new file. When you see this new file with 2 arguments, the first one being a file, it uses that first argument as basically the parent folder, and then tacks the second argument in as like a child of that folder. Right, so we're saying it's based on this directory, and then I want the file within that folder. Okay? So I take the string file name that I have, plus the file object that I have that is the parent, stick those things together, and now we've got a combined path. Cool? Random question. there's a path separator being introduced here. Does everybody know what the path separator is in Linux?
Underscore maybe?
So if I separate different portions of different directories and files, what is it on Windows?
I think on Windows it's a // and Linux it's a //
You're right. Yes. On Windows it's a / like this, which oftentimes means you have got to escape it again, because that's our escape character, you know, /n and the like. So oftentimes in code you've got to write it as that. And so Linux said, oh, that's a pain in the butt, let's make it easy for programmers, and we'll use the other / because I don't have to escape that one. So Linux uses the / versus Windows uses the \. Michael, do you know which / that Mac uses?
I think it's like the Linux one. Like
I'm pretty sure it's the Linux one. It's a /. Which / do we use in URLs?
It's always forward.
/. So who won? Basically, Windows is the only one where you use \/ to separate paths. It's worth mentioning in a lot of cases, Windows today doesn't really care. A lot of times you can use \ and / interchangeably in Windows, and Windows is fine. Okay. Linux, on the other hand, is very strict that it has to be the /. It won't accept backslashes as path separators, which also applies to Android, right? So if you are trying to put these things together, do be careful to make sure you're using the right slashes if you're using string concatenation. Cool? Everybody good with me?
Interesting.
Little inherent thing. You're not seeing that because I'm doing it this way. The reason I'm doing it this way, this avoids the whole question of which way the slashes are, because it figures it out. Whether it's on Windows or Linux, this figures it out. Next thing I'm going to tell it to do is I'm going to tell it to create the directories if they need to be created. So down to where my file is located, I want to make sure those folders are created. And then next thing I'm doing is I'm creating a new temporary file, and finally I'm returning. Okay, so I'm doing some setup there. That's all to generate that unique file. Now, because I've had some issues, I've had some things not working here, I'm going to kind of bring in some parts of that, and we can see if we can troubleshoot a little bit. So I'm actually going to skip these two parts for the moment, because I'm kind of wondering if that was maybe part of my issue. So I'm going to just bring in part of the code. Okay. Now, if we're looking at this, one big question I would ask, okay, remember that we are putting some code into the vModel, and we're putting some code into the activity. Where should this go?
Activity.
You say the activity, why?
Because the view model affects, right now it's only affecting database information.
Okay.
Since our information is not coming from the database, it's coming from the local.
Yeah, we're working with local files. Okay. Just one good argument. Any other arguments? Thoughts? Does Firestore work with local files? Do you remember how there's like a cache anytime you request data? It's writing that to local files. So Firestore is doing local file stuff. It's legitimate that you could put file stuff into the view model. That's perfectly legal and it's perfectly reasonable. Okay. In fact, that would kind of be the ideal, is that anything that has to do with files ideally would be over in the space of working with the vModel and shouldn't be in the activity. The gotcha, remember our big friend, the context? Unfortunately, there's a lot of places in the API where you still end up, if you're working with local files, you need a context, and so It kind of is more Android specific. So there's a lot of things you really do have to do in the activity. So I am gonna put this in the activity, not because I really want it to be there, but it kind of has to be there, at least for the current state of Android. Cool? And basically, I can't extract it to the view model that I'd like to. All right, so let's put this in. So I'm going to go back to main activity. I am going to add a method all the way down at the bottom. Private file create image file. This can throw an IO exception. And I'm going to use my logic to generate that file name. Bring that in. I need to import locale and import the calendar class. So that's step one, is create the file name. Next order of business is we need to create the paths. And so that's where I'm going to try and get the storage directory, and I'm going to stick that on to the file name that we just created and put those parts together. And when that's all done, I'm going to return that file object. Make sense? So we have to figure out where's the root and where we can put our pictures. We add our generated name to that, and then we finally return that. Okay. So that's going to give us a file. It's going to give us a place. Say, hey, I'm going to store the image that we take with the camera from here, and I'm going to return that up. Okay. Now, one thing to remember, and we're kind of deep in the weeds, so we might have lost this at this point. Remember, for the camera, what kind of thing do I need? I don't need a file object. I need a URI object. Okay, so both for the camera and to upload it to Firebase storage, I need a URI and not a file. Everybody with me there? Okay. So remember that a URI can start a few different ways. It starts with a protocol. Erase this here. And so oftentimes we're kind of familiar with things that start with HTTP//. That would be an HTTP. It would be both a URI and a URL. Okay? When we're talking about URIs, it allows for other ones. Other common ones you might see is FTP//. But the main two ones that we work with on the Android side, where we're dealing with local files, they're going to start with, there's two options. You can start with file, or you can start with content. Okay, so those are the two main URIs you're going to see working with local files. They either start with file // or content //. Okay. File // is relatively simple. File / says, hey, I'm referring to a file on the system, okay? So it's actually really easy to get to a file URI from the file object, because I really just need to take the path out here and I put the path in afterward, right? So if it's in the, say, the app, pictures, profile dot JPEG, right? So that would be a valid file URI. It just starts with a file / and that's a path to where it is on the system. Okay? Those are easy to generate. Unfortunately, we can't pass them around in Android anymore. Okay? So if I have something like this, that works for maybe myself using it, but I can't hand it to another application with the current security rules as it stands. Is everybody with me there? Mm-hmm. So in order to pass it off to the camera app, I have to convert it to a URI that starts with content. Is everybody tracking with me there? Now these ones are kind of weird. Okay. File is pretty simple. It's just the path where it is on basically the hard drive, on the storage. Content goes through a system called file providers. And so whenever you have a content URI, it goes looking in the Android operating system for the appropriate file provider and uses that access pattern. Okay? So in order to do this, we're going to have to work a little bit with something called a file provider. Okay? Let's go ahead and take a break. Let's stretch our legs, and we'll talk about that next. So where I kind of left us off is we built up this file object using all the logic for the file name, using logic to, okay, let's go find the particular parent directory where we want to store this, and finally we will return this. This function as it stands currently isn't being used. But remember, we need to convert it, we need to get that file object into a URI so that we can actually utilize it. Okay? So maybe the one, to just kind of break this up and not have it all in one function, maybe I'll create another function. So private URI, and I'll call this file to URI. So what it's going to take is a file, and it's going to return a URI, right? Because we need to take this file object that we have, working with the file APIs, and we need to go into URI land, okay? And so preferably what we'd like to have is we need to end up with this content URI, okay? It's going to take us a bit of a detour to get there. But let's start with, well, what if I just wanted a file URI, right? What if I just wanted a file URI? Well, the way file URIs are structured is really all you have to do is you just say file plus the actual path on disk. So one thing I could do here is I could say, hey, let's take the string file / and append to that file.toString. Okay, that will actually get us to a URI if we would turn that into. And I think actually I saw in there, oh, there's even a to our URI function, right? So I could do something like this. I'd say, hey, let's take this pathway and turn it into a URI. Now, looking at this, oh, that's interesting. To URI returns a URI, why is there an uppercase URI and a URI in camel case? Right? So if I call .toURI, I get this uppercase URI object. But what I really need to work with the other APIs is this one. So we've kind of got a bridge between, remember that there's Java, Android, there's Java, and there's Android Java, right? So in the world of Java, that's where the file class comes from. It's java.io.file. Similarly, there's a java.net.uri and a java.net URL. Those are both standard Java classes, okay? And so if I call toURI, I get a standard Java URI. But what we need is actually an Android URI, which lives under the package android.net URI. You see this? So we have to kind of get it into being an Android-specific URI, which is where things get maybe a little bit problematic. Now, if I'm looking at this class, okay, does the URI class have any constructors? It looks like here it only has the one, right? And let's check that looking at the documentation. So going to Android developers, I can look up the URI class, make sure I'm on the right one. And you might notice public methods that there isn't really a constructor for a URI in the Android space. Okay. Now there is a URI builder, and I can construct one that way, right? So if I wanted to potentially turn this into that, one way I could go about this is I could say new URI dot builder, construct a builder instead, because we are allowed to construct a builder even though we're not allowed to construct an actual URI. And what I can then do is start to add pieces to it. So for instance, I can specify the scheme as file, and I'm not sure if that needs to start with, look at the documentation. Does that need to start with the, include the / or does it not include the //? So set scheme, oh, I'm in the wrong class. I need to be in here, I need to be in the builder. So I say scheme here. Okay, so it looks like the scheme does not need to have the //. Okay, good. So I can say a file scheme, and then I can say, okay, the path, check that again. The path, I want to put that in, yes. Okay, path, and that would be file. All right, oh wait, what's that? Oh, that's backwards. Okay. Oh, there is one. I'm like, there is one. So I could go that way. Let me just do that. From file, And so if I do this, URI.fromFile, take a file, that's going to get me to this sort of file URI. Okay, it's going to start with file colon. Okay. So I could do that. And let me come back. Let me take that approach for the moment, and I'll come back to it because I doubt that's going to work. But let's go ahead and try it and see what happens. So I've got kind of two steps there, right? So I can create a file object and create the file, and I can also create a URI from that file. Okay. So what I want to do is when the user clicks on the button, when they click on the camera button, I need to generate a URI that is going to be where we output the file, right? So first steps first is I'm going to say, hey, let's make a file. We'll call this the output image file, and that comes from create image file, and then I'm going to convert that over to a URI, call that output image URI, and that is file the URI. I'm going to take the first thing, output image file, stuff it in, and get the out. So I'm going to first create a file object, and I'm going to convert it to a URI. Okay. Now you might notice the red underline, right? You see on create image file. That's because that function can throw an I/O exception, right? This could crash. Okay, this could fail. So I do need to handle that here, but at this point I'm ready to do that, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap those 3 lines. I'm going to say let's try all this stuff. Let's try to do all of these conversions. We'll try to create the file, convert it to a URI, and also then subsequently pass it to the launcher. And if anything goes wrong, I'll catch those exceptions. Now, it turns out that, at least in my testing, I got some exceptions that were not I/O exceptions, so I'm going to go ahead and just catch all types. Okay. So if anything goes wrong with this process, I'm going to just go ahead and log it to the console. Log.e, and we're going to log tag, take picture failed, with the exception, so that we can debug it a little bit. Now I missed one step. Notice on line 78, I need to pass this output image URI into that launch function and provide it to the launcher. Otherwise, we created it and just discarded it. Cool? Questions? Make sense? Okay. So let's go on to try what we have so far.
Just
yes.
Curious, this file to URI method.
Yep.
Is it equivalent to doing what we did in the file to URI? Oh, never mind. Sorry, this is right. Never mind.
Okay. Partly I'm making a function there so I can swap that code in with something else, because it's a process in and of itself. So here, if I click on camera, make sure I'm looking at the right one. Oop, take picture failed. And here we can see it's logging what occurred. It's a file, storage, emulated, pictures. There's my image URL, my image file name. And it says exposed beyond the app through clipdata.item.getURL. You see that? So first of all, I can see there is the URI that I produced. So everybody see that? That's the URI that we ended up producing. Okay. And so basically the first part of that is the protocol, file // that third slash on through storage is the place where the file would actually be on the device, okay? So we can see storage is just kind of a standard name on the device. Emulated 0, we're looking at kind of like emulated hard disk 0, or the first emulated hard disk is basically what we're seeing there. That first part is there. Don't rely on that being stable. That first part, storage emulated 0, is by no means guaranteed to always start that way. So one of the things you might notice is I didn't code that in. That just kind of came automatically. We want that. Okay, that's one thing to watch out for, because that is one thing that changes from device to device. You'll see pictures because we asked for the pictures directory within there, and you'll see this. Okay, so what does it say? File URI exposed exception. Well, basically what's happening is we build a file URI successful, but then we've tried to pass that off to another app, and it says I can't do that. I can't put a file URI into a intent, basically. This would go into an intent, it's going over to the other application, and I can't do that. I could do that within my own app. This would be fine to pass around with explicit intents to my different activities, but I can't send this off to another application. Is everybody on board with that?
I thought we were passing in an output URI though.
Notice I'm calling take picture launch. That ends up generating an intent, an implicit intent, that goes to another activity. So this is going to another app. I'm trying to start up. Okay. So we're basically saying you can't do that because these are your private, your own files. Okay. So in order to pass it over with the current Android space, I have to get it into a content URI. Okay. Again, if I was if the camera app was part of myself, I wouldn't run into this. But I'm running into this because I'm running to another app. Okay? So, let's look at what we need to do. So that simple approach of taking it, turning it into a file URI doesn't work. What I need to do is something more complex. Before I get into the weeds with that, I should actually put a little bit of logging in here, because now I'm thinking about it. Because I do need to log.i. I do want to log both of these two things, because some of the error messages don't tell you, say, what your file path is, and they don't tell you maybe what your URI is. So I might want to quickly log those two things out just to make sure that we have them going forward. So I'm going to log the file, and I'm also going to log the URI. So that when I try to do this, I should have those two logs happen before it logs the error. So it should look like something like this. So you can see the URI and you can see the file. You can see both of what those paths are. Cool. That's super, super useful. Being able to see those two things is super useful from a debugging standpoint. Okay, now, what I want to do, instead of this, is I need to go through that file provider, right? So this file provider is we're going to use to convert them to content URIs, okay, rather than to file URIs. So I'm going to say return file provider. It's a static method that I need to call on here. And so there's two versions of this. get URI from file. It needs a few things. It needs a context is one of them. And so this is one of the parts that kind of keeps us living in the activity space, is because I need a context to do this conversion. Okay. The next thing I need is some sort of what's called the authority. We're going to come back to that because I have to talk about how we're going to get that. The third argument is going to be file. Okay. That's the file we want to convert to a content URI. All right, everybody good? Okay. So a file provider is kind of like its own component, right? So we've talked about we've talked about some app components. We've talked mostly about activities. We talked a little bit about fragments. I mentioned there's also services and broadcast receivers a long time ago. But there's another part that's maybe a little bit less used, something called the content provider. Well, this is related to that, okay? File providers and content providers are kind of in that same space. So content providers can be things like, they can be providing your contexts, but here in the specific case of file provider, we're talking about something that is providing files to other applications. Make sense? So in some sense, we have to kind of expose our files to the public so that the camera app can use it, okay? And so the authority is kind of going to be our special permission string of, say, you have to have this permission, or you have to have this authority to be able to grant other apps to use your files. Make sense? So that's one string that we need to get right in order for this to work. So I'm going to bring back my notes. And we'll do this in a second. I am going to make that file provider the authority. I'm going to make it a constant to make sure that we have the right thing. But as far as, yeah, this got introduced in 7.0. So as far as setting up the file provider, okay, I'm borrowing some information from a particular article here called Setting Up File Sharing. Okay. So to securely offer your app, offer files from your app to another app, which we're kind of doing here, we need to configure the app to offer some sort of secure handle, which comes in the form of these content URIs. So it's kind of a handle that can be shared between two apps so that they can both write the file, but nobody else can write it, right? So rather than sharing it with making it public and everybody can see it, only these two apps that are talking to each other can use it. So the file provider is going to generate one of these content URIs based on some things that we provide in the XML. So this is where we go into it. Okay. So the first thing we have to do is in the manifest, we have to define a file provider. Okay. In the manifest, we have to define a file provider. This basically says, hey, there's some files I want to share. Here's the files that I'm going to share. Okay? Here's how you can find them. So we've got to add this provider tag that we've got here into our application. We've got to add the provider to our application. Okay? So in our app, pull this up. I'm going to go to the manifest, and you can see right now I've got an application tag, I've got the manifest at the root, I've got a few activities. So the provider is going to go after the activities within the application. Okay. So within the application, I'm going to add a provider. I need to specify a few things, as you can see. So for instance, the name of this is Android X core content file provider. The authority is a string that we come up ourselves. Okay, Now, the rules for that is you take the package name. So I'm going to pull the package name that I have up here. Mine is edu Ranken PureSmith ImageUpload. Yours is likely going to be different, but take whatever your package name is, and then at the end append dot file provider. That's convention for how you're going to need. So that is our authority string. Also in here, we need to say whether or not it grants permissions. We're going to say grants URL permissions yes. And we also are going to say exported no. But maybe I'm going to try exported true here. I'm going to try exported true and see if that makes any difference. So exported true, and then within there I need a meta tag, metadata. This is required, it's not optional. So I need to say Android name. It's Android.support dot file provider. Okay, so let me just copy that over so I don't mistype it. And then finally I need to specify the Android, the resource, and that's going to look like so. Now there's two important parts to this. The first part is that I need to specify the authority. Remember, the authority needs to be the package name dot file provider, so it needs to follow that convention. It means every app is going to have its own authority. Okay? The other thing that's important here with this metadata is basically this file provider paths points to a separate XML file where we define the folders that we're sharing. Okay? Is everybody good with that? We're defining the folders that we share with. We're going to share. This gets a little bit interesting in terms of how to create this. So let me walk you through it. You're going to right click on the res folder. You're going to say new. We're going to go to Android resource file. Okay? We're going to new Android resource file. Okay? Careful what I enter here. So I'm going to enter file paths, no spaces, no underscores, because that's what I had here. Okay, so it needs to match exactly what I have there. And then under the resource type, we're going to make sure that we pick the right type. So we're going to say that this is just an XML file, right? Which basically means that it has no kind of standard meaning, right? It's not it's just an XML file that's going to go into the XML directory. Versus other files that we've created with XML go into layout and drawable and bitmap and values, etc. This is going to go into that XML directory. The root element is going to be, it's going to be at the root. This is going to be a paths element. And then again, it's going into the XML directory. Okay, so now that I've got all that, I'm going to hit OK, and it's going to generate this file. Okay. So it should have paths as the root document. It should be named filepaths.xml. It should be under the XML folder. So everybody got that? Okay. So within there, I'm going to add a little bit of code. Boop. Which this is saying that I'm sharing two different folders. Or two different places. I think maybe what I don't know, this is one of the things that I haven't troubleshooted fully yet. There's an external path and there's an external files path. and I haven't figured out what the difference between the two is, but obviously they're both there. So external path or external files path, those are saying, here are some files, here are some directories that I don't own that are kind of in the external folder, the public folder, that can be shared between different apps. And this is what I'm exposing is stuff that's in the pictures folder within there, right? Giving that a name, I'm calling this public images. And then on the other one, this is my local files. I would call that private images. So if I want to share some private files, that's going to open this door up. If I want to share public files, they're going to open that door up. Okay? So you can specify both. Files that are public and files that are private. Cool? Okay. So I've got those two in there. You can add as many as you need. I'm going to go back to main activity now. Or I'm going to go back to the manifest. In the manifest, you'll see that that's now resolved, right? So that should no longer be read, okay? If you've got the file and such set up. Now, I'm going to go back, and I need to go back to my code. Remember, I specified this authority. So that authority does have to go back in here as the second argument to get URI from file. Now, rather than hard coding that in there because it makes it harder to tell what it is or to find it maybe later, I would want to go ahead and add a constant. So I'm going to add a constant, and this is here. I'm going to call that file provider authority. Pull that up. Okay, so that's what that's going to look like. Again, this should match whatever you have in your manifest, and it's going to be your own package name. So my authority is going to look different than yours. Cool? Okay. So let's try this with all of that in place. So it looks like it's failing to start up for me. Oh, okay. It says unable to get provider, file provider, because the provider must not be exported. Okay. So exported has to be false. That's good to know.
What were you trying to do by setting it to true? What were you thinking might be available?
That it might make it available to other apps, but apparently it doesn't like that. So it has to be false. Okay. So I'm going to go to camera again. All right. Well, that did go to the camera app without crashing. I'm going to hit, and I can look at what the URIs are, right? So you can see output image URI. We can see the content URI. Now, interesting thing to pay attention on the content URI. Okay. Now, notice the content, this URI actually has nothing to do with my file, my file path. You see that? They're not directly connected. Previously, it was just concatenation. I would just say put file : / at the beginning and then the path at the end. Here it is content. It's the name of my file provider, right? So basically that file provider gets registered system-wide. It goes to that file provider and says, hey, under your public images, remember we set that up in the XML file. Okay, under your public images, let's go give me this specific image. Cool? So there's a little bit more going on with that conversion, is what you should see. And when it requests that URI, there's more that has to happen. Oh, I closed it out. Okay, so I'm going to take a picture. I'm going to hit the check mark to say yes, I want to send that back. Okay. And you might see here, takes picture, result false.
I got true.
You got true?
I don't know what happened.
You got true?
I got true.
You got true. Okay. I'm curious what you did different. You got true.
I don't think I did anything.
How did you get true? So what did you get? Oh, okay. That's interesting. Did anybody else get anybody else get false? Remind me about false. Makes me wonder what we have differently. Okay. Let me try this. I previously tried to downgrade to API 28. What API are you on, if I can ask, Evan?
How do I figure? Is that build it real?
30.
You're on 30
Is that
on
correct?
emulator, and you're also 30? Let me try 30 again.
I'm actually targeting API level 32.
Yeah, but the question was about the emulator.
Oh, emulator? Oh, okay.
So you're running 30.
Yeah, 30 of course. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So what we should, in theory, be able to do, if it's returning false or returning true, what we should be able to do is go back up here. What we want to do is check the result first. So if objects dot equals, so I'm doing objects plural and comparing listings. Remember, this is because I've got a Boolean uppercase type, which can be null. So I want to check it this way. So I'm going to say if the result equals Boolean true, we're going to try and upload the image that we got. Otherwise, there's an error. So that's my case, right? So I might say here, log E and unfortunately, I don't have a stack trace at that point. It doesn't give me any more information other than it's false. Okay, so in the case where it did upload the picture, what I'd like, I did get a picture. What I'd like to do is I'd like to call our upload image folder, image file, image method that we had previously from picking something from the gallery, from the file picker. But I've got a problem, right? I don't have access to the URI for the file that it wrote. Yes.
You're talking about this URI with
Right.
within the try, right?
Yeah. So in the try catch, in here, I have this image URI, but I don't have any access to that because that's a local variable. It's now out of scope when I go to my launcher. Okay, so workaround, we do end up needing to put this into a instance variable
Oh, okay.
in order to pass it around. What were you going to suggest?
I thought you were about to say try with resources.
No, try with resources would just help us with cleaning things up, which wouldn't help us transfer things over. So I'm going to add a pair of variables. I'm going to save the file just for symmetric, making it kind of look symmetrical. Output image file. Going to make that an instance variable, and I'm going to make a URI here. Private output image URI. So I'm going to save both of those things to instance variables. And then I'm going to read that when it comes back. So I'm going to save it to an instance variable, and I'll read it when the result comes back. Okay? That means I need to change the code further down. So here in the onClick listener, I need to just remove the types so that those are being saved to instance variables instead of those are being saved to local variables. Cool? Okay. Let's give her a roll. Take picture, hit that, go back. Oh, well, it worked for me that time. So you can see I've come back here. I've even got a download URL because it looks like all of that worked. So API 30. Do I have no stack trace there? Oh, there it comes. Okay, it worked this time. Interesting. Okay. So all of that worked through, we've uploaded it to the internet.
That's tremendous.
I hope you can be on board with me to say this is a lot more code than I would like it to be. To get things from like, hey, I go take a picture with the camera, to get it up to the internet. But such is the world of Android today. Any questions right now with that? I mean, obviously we've covered a bunch of different bases. We've talked about a bunch of different things along the way. Cool.
Exactly, it shows up
Yep.
in storage. You go to Firebase.
Yes, yeah, you should be able to go up to storage. I'll go pull that up on my end. So if I go to the Firebase console, I'll go to storage there. I'll go to user. Which one is my user ID? I am logged in as easy. Okay. So storage, user, easy. Yeah, and so you can see the image that I uploaded there. Awesome. So there's a few things that you'll still need to do. In terms of working with, let's see if we can talk about this today or not. There's a few things that you'll still need to do from there. So on the view model side, both of these pathways, whether we are capturing a photo or whether we are getting it from the gallery. One of the things we're not doing is we're not checking that it's actually PNG here on the back end. I'm assuming that it's PNG, but I'm not actually converting it to PNG anywhere in the code. So just one big heads up. Okay. So that might be something you would want to do. Okay. I'm not going to cover that right now. The other thing here is, so we're doing two things. Remember we did some nesting yesterday. So first things we need to do is upload the file. That happens with put file. And then later when that's successful, we're calling get download URL, right, to get the downloaded URL to download it. Okay. There are a few steps that I need to take as a whole to get to our final result. So if I'm looking at here, I have a note on it. The entire kind of process looks like this. We create the storage reference. We upload the file using put file. We also typically need to add some metadata. So for instance, that would usually be what the width and height of the image is. We would usually do that at that point, or say, hey, this belongs to this user ID, etc., things like that. Don't worry too much about step 3. I'm not concerned about that for your assignment. But that's where that would land. Okay. The next thing is where we're going to ask for get download file. So we've kind of done steps 1, 2, and 4. Okay. After that happens, you still need to update the Firebase user with the updated URI. And that specifically needs to be the download URI. Why? Well, the local URI that you started with isn't going to work for any other devices. It's only good for your device.
Oh.
So in order for this to function, you do need the download URL to be the thing that you stuff into the user. Same thing with updating the user document in Firebase. In the Firestore, you'll need to update that with the download URL. Cool. That way other users can see your image. If you put the wrong URI in there, then only you will be able to see your image and nobody else will be. So if you see it in there, if you look at the database and it says content, you know you're putting the wrong one up there. It should start with HTTPS. Okay? Questions? So I think you can tackle that part. I think you can read through the documentation and kind of figure out those last few steps. I would really recommend as you're structuring this, one of the things to keep in mind is there's kind of a lot of nesting here. You had a hand up?
Oh wait.
What was it?
Oh, I was just going to ask about the PNG thing you were talking about. So it shows this type in the database is image JPEG.
Oh, okay.
Does that mean that if we download this, it'll be a JPEG with .png in the file name and then
So
.jpeg?
that means that Firestore has actually recognized that it was a JPEG, even though the file extension was .png.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
That means that Firestore has recognized that.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that everything will recognize that. That just means that Firestore has realized that. So that doesn't guarantee that, like, Picasso will Picasso know that it's a JPEG instead of a PNG. Cool?
Cool. Just wanted to know what was going on there.
So, as what I was talking about with the nesting, right? This does work. How many levels deep is this going to be when you're done? How many levels deep are we right now? At least 2, right? At least 2, because we're, I would say we're actually a little bit more, because here's an outer function. Here's another function. And then within that function, there's another function. So there's kind of like 3 nested functions happening here, right? I'd like to keep that down to 2. Right? It's really hard to go below 2. But I'd like to, where I possibly can, keep that down to 2. Should I be on board with that? Okay. If I look at what you're going to need to do, if you wanted to do this whole process, adding another 3, right? So to do this whole thing, you're looking at like 6 functions nested inside of each other. You heard the term callback hell? That's callback hell, right? So you could do it that way. Are there any ways that you could do this differently so you don't have to nest that deep? How could we write this so we don't have to nest that deep?
Maybe this idea is not so good an idea because it adds a lot more code, but could we do live data and then in the activity observe the live data and then call those things as live data is changed?
So that's a question, and the answer is you would definitely not want to do that. Why? First of all, there's a lot of complexity with it. Second of all, there's a timing question. So remember, first of all, that live data isn't necessarily always observed. The live data is only being observed as long as the activity is active, right? So it may be that you have events happening and your observers aren't listening to them at the time, so that would mean that those steps could only happen while the user's actively on that screen. Okay? It will only happen while the user's actively on that screen. It also creates this back and forth where something happens in the model, and then you've got to handle the event in the activity, and then trigger something again in the model. And so you're traveling back and forth, and that creates a high degree of what we would call coupling, where the code is really intertwined, and it's kind of hard to understand what's happening just by looking at either side. Right? You really have to kind of understand both things and follow that pathway, right? So I'd like something that maybe follows a little better. Thoughts? How many functions do I have right now here? I've got 3, right? Lambdas and actual functions are kind of interchangeable, right? What if I break these out and make these actual functions? What if rather than having all of this code in this one function, I break it down into smaller functions? Okay.
You're talking about getting rid of the lambda and replacing it with the name of the method?
I'm not talking about getting rid of the lambda per se. I'm talking about breaking this up into 2 functions, right? Because there's 2 steps. At least 2 steps, right? There is the put file step where we're uploading it. There's also the download step where I'm getting the download URL, right? I could break those up into 2 different parts. Does that make sense? I can break those up into 2 different parts. Where do I break them? Where's the part that gets the download URL start? What line number is that? There's an extractable piece.
So just to be clear, you said you don't want to get rid of the lambda. You want to keep the lambda.
Yeah.
Which means you want to keep the task and the download task local variables, right? So we're just breaking up the code inside the lambda.
Not exactly.
No,
Not exactly. So let's think about what happens, right? So first thing is this outer part, right? Let me collapse here. That was the wrong way. There. So this is all kind of the outer function. You see that? The next thing inside of there is there's the function that we get when the operation completes, right? But this code is kind of tied to the code that came before it. It's not really divisible from the code that initiated the operation. I could, but it goes well together with the code that came before it. But if I look down at line 64, going on down, you see that I start changing topics, right? 64 is kind of doing something else. It's another step in the chain. So I could break that out as another function. Okay, so what I'm going to do is define another function, public void, get profile image download URL. Or I could just call this, I probably just call this get download URL. No, I'm going to leave that as that one. Get profile image download URL. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to take this bit of code here, 64 down to 76, cut it out, and move it down here. And so this is just going to call get download image download URL. I'm going to make the second function private because the only context it should be called from is within this function. I don't want anywhere else to accidentally call it. Now, you might notice that there's some kind of broken references because, okay, it doesn't know how to find storage ref. You see that? So I need to pass some things down, right? I need to provide some data onto further steps. So if I need the storage reference, well then I need that to be a parameter to this function. And I can pass it in where I call it. So that way I make sure that this here and this here end up referring to the same storage ref. One very cautious thing that we want to do here, one thing that sometimes we do to make things wider scoped is introduce local instance variables. Don't do that here, okay? If you introduce this as an instance variable, then that is something that's shared between all of the operations that might be running, right? I only want to share that between these two functions. And so I really, really want that to be a parameter and not an instance variable, because it matters if you're doing things in parallel. Okay? Yeah.
Also, did you mean to put line 64 there, or did you mean to put it on line 61, 62 image?
I think I made the change I meant to, but I don't know which line you're talking about. This one?
Line 64, the method call, did you mean to put it there, or in the other case? It's an if else statement, you put it inside the else?
Yeah, it's in the case where it needs to be. It's in the case where it needs to be.
Okay.
So we only need to call the download if it's successfully uploaded.
Okay.
Right? I only need to ask for, can I download it, or where can I download it from if I've uploaded it. So that deals with the first error case, and then this deals with the second case, the second step in the process. And you can kind of envision this continuing, right? So I might say, okay, well, I need to do step 3. So I would do that here. Right, in the success case. Or whatever step was that, let me just say do next step. Or update the auth database. And then from there, we'd also need to update the Firestore database. So you're going to have this chain of several functions that just kind of call each other. That's the way I would break it. Questions? Yeah.
Where did you write that thing where you said you wanted us to do 2 more things? Word or something?
Yep, let me grab it. It was in the middle of my notes.
There it is.
Yep. So I'm going to stick this up to